right. Well, hello, everybody. Thank you for coming today. I appreciate you being here, and those folks that are watching at home, thank you for tuning in with us today. I'm glad you've joined us, and I'm very excited to be doing this program. This is a program that we've been trying to host now for, it seems like forever. But you know what? We're here today, and we're doing it. I thank you to our limited in-house audience, and again, those at home. If I could ask everyone, especially at this time, as there's so much going on in the world, maybe it's a good time we all pause, rise, and stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. So we've got an American flag here. Please join me in the pledge. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Could I recognize anybody at home and here that are military veterans or active duty? Thank you. Thank you at home. Thank you in person. Thank you for your service. We appreciate it. Well, here we are at the Palm Springs Air Museum. We are open. Our hangar doors are wide open. Our aircraft are here for viewing. Our gift shop is open. Our ride program is taking place. So we are hanging in there, folks. So I want to thank everybody that's been donating and tuning in online and checking out our Warbird Wednesday and all the different things the Air Museum's been trying to do just to keep the word going and to try to keep the public aware that we're still continuing with our mission, which is to preserve, educate, and honor. So I want to thank one and all. I want to thank our volunteers who've persevered with us as well. So thank you all. And speaking of volunteers, our featured speaker today, Mr. Pete Fleury, is one of our volunteers. He's actually got a lot more history that I'd like to share with you, though. He served for 23 years in the United States Army, Army Reserves, and the National Guard. After graduating from Field Artillery Officer Candidate School, he spent 1 year in South Vietnam as a battery executive officer, fire direction officer, and forward observer. He then entered helicopter flight school and transitioned to the CH-47 Chinook before returning to Vietnam, where he logged more than 800 combat flying hours. Thank you, Pete. Thank you for your service. There's more. After leaving active duty, he spent 26 years in military aerospace industry with Rockwell International, Kaiser Electronics, Boeing Modernization, Mission Avionics, and Weapons Control Systems for the United States and international military operators. Pete is a volunteer, as I said, here at the Palm Springs Air Museum, where he is a crew chief and a classroom instructor here with us. Our volunteers do so much, as I say all the time, they are our bread and butter here, and here we have a volunteer hosting one of our Saturday programs. So won't you all please welcome our featured speaker today, talking about Pan American Airways Africa 1941 to 1942, Mr. Pete Fleury.
Thanks, Greg. And welcome, first of all, Happy New Year. And welcome to the first of our Saturday presentations for the new year. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about an operation involving 1,000 Americans before we were officially in World War II. It's a very kind of unsung and unknown operation, partially because it was classified in the beginning. It takes a long time to unclassify things. And also, shortly after Pan Am Africa got into operation, December 7th came along, and all our attention was on Japan. This is a very interesting story, and I got interested in it because my dad was there as part of Pan Am Africa. I didn't know much about it because, like all of the great Americans of that era, he didn't talk about the war when he was finished. He simply moved on. And when I finished, or when he died, then all I had to look at was his logbook and some photographs. Greg, I'm not advancing here. Try that. Technical problem here. Plan B. I can touch the computer, that's fine.
I'm not sure the way it's working. That one isn't. But if you click that button, it's working.
Okay.
And the pointer still says work.
So Pan American Airways, Africa, had a very curious and spontaneous beginning. I mentioned my dad's logbook, and it piqued me that there were so many very long flights. You have no idea how big Africa is until you start to look at how long it turns to fly across the continent. So that got my interest, and then I needed some information. And I found one of the few definitive publications about it is a book called Pan Africa Across the Sahara in 1941 with Pan Am. And it was written by a veteran of Pan Am and co-authored by Tom Colbert, who in his 21-year Air Force career spent 5 years in Africa, living in Africa, flying in Africa. So he knew a lot about Africa. And he then further spent some time in Washington, he lives in that area, peeling back archives in Washington to definitize the work that Pan Am did. And he was also instrumental in helping me put together this presentation. If this presentation piques your interest, I'll tell you how to get this book far cheaper than you can on Amazon. 1941 was a real critical situation for the British. They were defending the Suez Canal from Cairo. That was a critical juncture because had the Germans captured the canal and the oil fields to the east, that would have been a major turning point early in the war. They had a very difficult time supplying those troops and air forces in Egypt because they either had to go around the Horn by boat, that took 3 weeks, or they could fly it across the southern Sahara. And the RAF was ill-equipped to do this. They were a fighting force, not an airline or air transport service. So they were really having a difficult time. And then a curious thing happened. Juan Trippe, the president of Pan Am Airways, was invited by the Royal Aeronautical Society, this was an annual event in London, to be the guest speaker, and he was talking about ocean navigation. Well, the British Air Ministry was very piqued by this because the sand in the Sahara is nothing but a sandy ocean, if you like to think about it that way. So they cornered him after the presentation to see if Pan Am could help in some way get this better organized. He was about to return to the United States when he received a message to meet with Winston Churchill at midnight that night at 10 Downing Street. So that was the birth of the idea for Pan Am Airways Africa, and it evolved very quickly after that. This led to a series of meetings between the United States and England and Pan Am. The United States government funded the entire operation. As the contracts were drawn together, there was a meeting, a secret meeting between FDR and Winston Churchill, and among many things they discussed in that meeting in August, certainly one of those was this arrangement with Pan Am Africa. Those contracts were already well along. It was announced on the 18th of August for the first time by the President of the United States. This operation had been secret up until this time. But he unveiled the fact that the United States was going to help the British in Africa by supplying their troops in the Middle East. Further, they were going to ferry U.S. government planes, part of the Lend-Lease Act, across the Atlantic for use not only by the British but by the Russians and by the all-volunteer group in China under Claire Chennault. The ferry and transport of these aircraft by Pan Am would ensure speedy delivery once they got the routes worked out. There were 5 contracts that were formalized. There were 2 with the British government, 3 with the United States government. The airline was chartered as a British airline to facilitate travel across the continent of Africa, because all these countries that it was going through were European colonies or protectorates at that time. It was much easier dealing with the British company in terms of all the licensing. It was divided into 2 efforts. One was Pan Am Africa to map the route and provide the facilities and the routing and the air transport. And that in itself was an undertaking. But then an adjunct to that was Pan Am Ferries to actually get the aircraft across the Atlantic into Accra, where Pan Am was situated, for further ferrying across the continent or all the way to China, as it might turn out. It wasn't just, you think about trying to get 1,000 people together to provide everything from aircraft facilities to mess halls to quarters to, they even built a church. So all this had to be planned and executed in a very short period of time once they got there. They got Pan Am employees from other divisions. 40 of the Army Air Corps pilots were given the offer and took the offer to set their commissions on the side and reserve status and go to work for Pan Am Africa. The uniform issue looked very familiar to me, thinking back on when I entered the Army. They had 6 pairs of trousers, 6 pairs of khaki coats, a raincoat, tropical helmet rather than a combat helmet, 12 shirts. My dad and a good friend of his that he made during flight school. They finished flight school in June of 1941, and they were then sort of stuck at Kelly Airfield. They made them instructor pilots in T-6s for future students. And I guess Kelly wasn't the greatest place to be at the time, but that was then. They saw this notice about a secret operation, be defined as to where they were going. However, the pay was $350 to start with, and if you got to be an airplane captain, it got up to $755. Well, that looked very attractive to somebody making less than $200 a month. So they were both single, and they said, what the heck, let's just do this. This is a telegram that was sent from the Pan Am headquarters in New York, asking 11 of those 40 officers I talked about to report from Kelly Field in the matter of 12 days, with passport photos in civilian clothes, ready to go. My dad and Chris Lund, his sidekick, were 2 of those people. And you'll notice the signature at the bottom says Christopherson. That was Harold Christopherson. He was the senior pilot for Pan Am Africa. He also had a son at that time by the name of Chris. So he got much more famous because of his son than because of Pan Am. The entire route structure was referred to as the Takoradi route because Takoradi was a British air base adjacent to Accra, where Pan Am Africa was situated. And this is where they flew the airplanes into the continent, whether they came from across the ocean from Brazil or whether they came off an aircraft carrier to be landed in the continent. This is where they started at Takoradi. It extended all the way, as you can see, to China. And we'll talk about that in a few minutes. I want you to note with some interest, see if I can get this going. Yeah, there it is. There's a place right in the middle of the route, sort of here in Africa, called El Fasher. And I'm going to talk more about El Fasher in just a moment. The uniform quickly evolved into shorts because this is a pretty hot climate. Accra was kind of like being in South America. And this is Chris Lund on the left. You'll notice there's a sidearm, and this gave you a false sense of security in case your airplane went down in the middle of nowhere. You can see my dad on the right side in Cairo sharpening his bargaining skills. So it wasn't always like they were flying. They did get some time in places like Cairo, for example. There was also a set of tennis courts in Al Fasher. It was set up by the British governor for the territory. This was taken out of my dad's camera. That's a Pan Am uniform this gentleman in the foreground is wearing. So it lent itself well to playing tennis, I guess. And my dad no doubt had a racket with him that day because he, in college, was a state level champion. The route was a real contrast of climates. I mentioned Accra being kind of like South America, the same latitude. You can't see it very well, but the equator runs right here. So it's that close to the equator. When you get up into the southern Sahara, it's just like here. Temperature is getting up to 120 degrees in the mostly hot all the time kind of season, more so than here because of its proximity. It's further south. So that presented another challenge just in terms of aircraft maintenance. You could only maintain the aircraft at night. They were too hot to handle, literally, during the day. I mentioned Al Fasher before. This is 21st century Al Fasher. You're looking down runway 23. It's a 9,700-foot runway that facilitates use by 3 regional airlines. They land 737s and Airbus A320 series aircraft. On the north side of the airfield was a helicopter operation. It was a UN operation for relief operations. So it's a very relatively busy airfield today, and the adjacent community of Al Fasher is 300,000 people. So that's today. 1941, in this kind of coarse photograph, it looked like this. Dirt runways. It's interesting to note that the turnaround that you see here in 1941 is the same footprint as the turnaround here today that they used to get onto the departure end of runway 23. And likewise, some of the taxiway infrastructure that they used then, you can see here today. On the ground, it looked just like the photo in the upper left-hand corner. I was always fascinated by the cloud behind the troops here. This was taken sometime after Pan Am turned over operation to the Army Air Corps, because all of these gentlemen, still taken out of Chris Lund's camera, were in Army Air Corps uniforms, sort of, at this time, given the heat. Chris Lund is right in the center of this photo, checking out some repair activity on this C-47. You'll notice the ingenious jack stand that was in use to keep the air, you have to have safety here, you have to have a jack stand. So Yankee ingenuity was always at work. You'll also notice that they had to dig about 2 or 3 feet into the ground to find sufficient footing for the jack, and that's very similar to here. This is the crew after apparently they finished working on the C-47, and looks like a happy crew because it appears they got some food. This was the operations building at Al Fasher. Needless to say, it did not have air conditioning at this time. They were probably lucky to have electricity, but that's how it operated. However, they did have a pet lion. His name was Leo. And Leo was a nice pet there until he got a little too big, a little too frisky, and they ended up putting him on a C-47 and flying him to a zoo in Cairo. It was interesting spooling up the operation for Pan Am Africa. They didn't have any spare airplanes necessarily to get this operation going, so the government acquired 11 DC-3s from various airlines and corporations. They ranged in use from 100 to 13,000 flying hours. They were in different configurations. Some of the corporate ones had sleeping accommodations and little windows above the regular windows for the bunks. So it was kind of a diverse fleet of DC-3s. as soon as we were officially into the war, they began sending new or almost new C-47s and C-53s to Pan Am Africa. Does anybody know the difference between a C-47 and a C-53? The 47 you're very familiar with. We have one here. It has a nice big set of clamshell cargo doors. It has a reinforced cargo floor. It also has a winch in the front part of the cargo area to drag cargo up the floor when the aircraft is being loaded on the ground. The C-53, by contrast, was pretty much a DC-3 painted olive drab, except that the seating inside was along both aisles or both sides of the aircraft as typical GIs sat sideways facing each other. It was a very good airplane for dropping paratroops. In this case, it transported personnel and light cargo. Most of the issue that they got from the United States government was in the form of C-53s. Oh, something I should mention, the 12 or 11 DC-3s, one of them burned up. My dad happened to fly that airplane into Kanawa in Nigeria, and after it was shut down and they were refueling it, it caught fire and destroyed the aircraft. The other DC-3s, as soon as we got a fair number of C-47s, were kind of like the Navy does with the Marine Corps. When they don't want something, they give it to the Marines. Well, in this case, we gave the DC-3s to the British under the Lend-Lease Act. Part of the job was to ferry these Lend-Lease aircraft across the continent. So I've got some slides showing some of the different aircraft that were ferried by Pan Am pilots. Now picture this. My dad's a brand new lieutenant. The fastest thing he's flown is a T-6 Texan. And Christopherson comes up and says, "How would you like to fly a Hawker Hurricane across the continent to Cairo for us?" So this is a 340 mile per hour airplane. This is hot stuff with a Merlin engine in it. And but first you had to get checked out. And this is not an eye test, but I'll talk about this logbook page. 5 days were spent getting checked out in the aircraft. He flew 3 different versions of this airplane, an hour to an hour and a half apiece. You had to pass a written or oral exam that certified the pilot that he knew how to operate the airplane. They used to do a blindfold test where the new pilot would sit in the aircraft blindfolded and identify all the critical switches and controls needed to operate the airplane in an emergency. So that's how you got checked out. You got checked out by jumping in the airplane and flying it. Once they got checked out, then the day after Christmas, he embarked on a 5-day mission to get the aircraft to Cairo. The way they did this, they would gather 6 Hurricanes in this case. They did the same thing with P-40s. They would use either a twin-engine bomber or a C-47 as the mothership with the navigator, of course. You couldn't do this by yourself in a single-seat airplane. And so it would lead the other 6 across the continent. So it took 4 nights and about 21 hours of flying time in one of these nice single-seat, unair-conditioned aircraft. They also ferried P-40s across the continent for 3 different customers. The British, shown here, also the Army Air Corps, using them later on, and the all-volunteer group, General Shun's Flying Tigers. Replacement aircraft came into Accra for flight clear across to China. That took, I'm trying to think, 16 days to get across to China, hopping along in a P-40. You couldn't go very far before you needed fuel. This is the USS Ranger, which brought over 2 plane loads of, or ship loads of P-40s, about 70 in each of those missions, and they would fly the aircraft literally right off the deck at Takoradi. The Douglas A-20 Boston, the Army Air Corps used this a little bit, like in, there was a contingent of them in D-Day invasion later on. It was really a light bomber, and some people ask, well, why isn't there a B in front of it instead of an A? If there was a B in front of it, a bomber, it had 2 pilots, like a B-17 or a B-24, for example. If, on the other hand, there was just 1 pilot, it was an attack airplane, A, even though it was dropping bombs, and it had a bombardier. So this was a single pilot aircraft, and it looks a little bit like an A-26, which came along later in the war, and we have one here in the museum. The A-30 Baltimore, if you'll notice, the British like to use cities in naming their bombers, usually the origin city where they were built, which is why you see Lancasters, for example, as a famous British bomber. In this case, Martin did not successfully sell this aircraft to the Army Air Corps, but it needed to have an official designation so that it could be sent to the British under the Lend-Lease program. So the A-30 Baltimore very similar to the A-20. The RAF also had B-24s under the Lend-Lease program, and what the pilots for Pan American would do is that they would ferry these aircraft from Egypt to a town called Gura in Asmara, about 5,000 feet elevation. Douglas had a maintenance facility there for overhaul. And so Pan Am would provide pilots, fly the B-24s and the P-40s that they had down to Gura in Asmara for maintenance or overhaul. So you can see that these pilots got to be very multilingual in airplanes. In April of 1942, there was a directive issued by the Army Air Corps to Pan Am to go help us and the British evacuate people out of China, or out of Burma, excuse me. It was being overrun by the Japanese, and a major effort was undertaken by Pan Am and Army Air Corps and the Royal Air Force to evacuate as many people as possible, not only expats that were in the area, but also natives who were sure to suffer under the Japanese invasion. They succeeded in evacuating over 3,000 people. No fatalities were taken by Pan Am, although one of the airplanes was damaged in a bombing raid. And they did successfully repair it in short order and get it out of there. There were lots of hazards in this job, although they weren't technically in a combat area. There were accidents every time an airplane quit. If it was a single engine plane, it was a forced landing. Or if they missed a destination on the first try, it became a forced landing when they ran out of fuel. So, an example of what could happen in the case of a one P-40 Pan Am pilot, he made a forced landing and violated rule number 1, which was stay with the aircraft. He wrote instructions out on the wing in chalk and an arrow in which direction he was going. He dropped to safety. They never found him again. So that was an example. Could happen if you didn't use your gun. There was also the problem, believe it or not, of friendly fire, which really is an acronym, or is an oxymoron in itself. There's no such thing as friendly fire. But the British gunners in Cairo would get bombed occasionally by the Germans. And so when any airplane came in, they tended to be a little trigger happy. So the PAA pilots devised a very expeditious way of getting in and out. They would fly down or fly up the Nile River at mast top level and pop up right at the end into the traffic pattern at the airfield in Cairo to avoid friendly fire. There were other examples of fatalities. One of our, it was a C-47. It was being serviced with just using an carbon dioxide cylinder to pump up one of the landing gear struts. It seized, exploded for lack of a better word, caused the airplane to catch on fire. It was destroyed. One person was killed. So in the time of 18 months, there were 10 PAA fatalities, which, given the scope and the size of this operation, is a pretty good safety record, but sad nonetheless. The natives were not always friendly either, although there were no fatalities or injuries resulting from any discord with the locals. It's hard to quantify the scope of what they did. Something I failed to mention in terms of supplies, when they were engaged in the Burma operation, they even loaded up some airplanes with 5-gallon cans of gasoline and flew them over the hump to China to resupply Chennault's P-40s. So there was no mission that was too difficult. And they were always hazardous. But Pan American Airways laid the foundation for the Tacarada route. As I said, it was taken over by the Army Air Corps after 18 months. That was an interesting transition. They gave the different members of Pan Am offers to join the Air Corps at a rank commensurate with what they were doing. So a maintenance technician might become a tech sergeant. Christopherson became a major. In fact, Christopherson stayed in the Air Force Reserves after the war and finished as a general. So if you didn't take that offer, you either found a job somewhere else in Pan Am, or you were issued a 1A draft card and sent back to the United States. So obviously those were offers that not many people refused. Eastbound cargo over 2 million pounds. Westbound cargo included valuable equipment, including captured German equipment and raw rubber. As near as records can show, over 11,000 aircraft and 101,000 military personnel used this route during its time. One of the more interesting passengers was Jimmy Doolittle. After he escaped to Chennault's area in China after the B-25 raid, he was transported across the Tacarada route by Pan Am. So, and there were other equally important passengers that in some areas just remained classified. They never declassified them. So we don't know everything about it. There is an epilogue to this thing with Chris Lund and my dad, Pete Fleury, also. They, along with Christopherson, all ended up flying for the Arabian American Oil Company. Lund and Fleury started out flying DC-6s and DC-4s across the Atlantic for administrative and logistical purposes between New York and Dhahran. Christopherson joined up about 5 years later, became the manager of the aviation department and then the manager of transportation for the oil company. In Arabia, you see what looks like a DC-3. They were called DC-3s. That's really a war surplus C-47. And there were 7 of those airplanes. The first one they got logged 26,000 hours before they sold it to somebody else in 1977. So a little bit of irony. My dad and Chris Lund began their flying career in the desert, and they ended it in the desert. I mentioned this book, if it piqued your interest at all. This is how you can reach Tom Colbert, the author, or you can go on Amazon and buy one for $150. That's the latest offering I see for a new edition of this book, because it's out of publication. It started in 1998. But Tom does have some copies of it. He would gladly sell to you for $30 plus postage, and you'd probably get an autograph in it as well. I'll leave that up if you want to copy it while I take any questions.
Did the personnel of Pan Am America, Africa, did they get credit as a veteran later on in their careers, or did they have to kind of restart again?
The question, as I understand it, was were the Pan Am employees classified as veterans? Yes and no. In the beginning, the answer was no. Later on, they were. So as time went on, when they needed help from the VA, they got it. Do I see another question? John?
Pete, how long did your father fly? Into what years?
He flew for 18 months, actually 16 months. He had malaria for 2 of those months that sidelined him. He was sent back to the United States during that time. But in 16 months, he flew 1,500 hours. So he was flying over 100 hours, or nearly 100 hours a month. 1 month he flew 130 hours. He went on from there back to the Air Transport Command in Detroit, where he was a B-24 instructor pilot. They would take aircraft straight off of the assembly line, use them to train new pilots to fly the B-24. He then went from there to Kansas and deployed with a B-29 unit, the first B-29 units to deploy during the war. Altogether, he flew about 3,000 hours during the war. And after that, he continued to fly more than 20,000 hours. Any other questions?
Did he live to see you fly?
Oh yes, the question from John was, did he live to see me fly? And the answer is yes. And in fact, it was one of my joys in addition to flying helicopters for the United States Army, I did get my private airplane license, and one of my real joys was to take him up in a Piper Cherokee and fly him across the channel to the islands off of Santa Barbara and back on the sightseeing tour. So that was kind of complete closure. Another question? A little louder, please. Bobby, my wife, points out that I'm in the process of eulogizing my dad at the Mount Soledad National Memorial to commemorate his service. Any other questions? Well, I thank you for coming. I thank those of you who are watching this online, and it's been a real pleasure to tell a story that was worth telling.
Well, thank you, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you to you folks at home. We've had a pretty good audience at home as well, so thank you all for coming in today. Join us as we continue this series. Thank you, Pete, for your service, and thank you to your father. Everybody, stay safe, keep on your masks, wash those hands, and hey, keep going back to the Air Museum. Thank you, one and all. We'll see you next week.